The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to today's webinar entitled Predictors of Postsecondary Success, Understanding the Value of Workforce Data, co-sponsored by the College and Career Readiness and Success Center at the American Institutes of Research and the American Youth Policy Forum. My name is Jennifer Brown-Lerner, and I will be serving as the moderator of today's event. First, a few logistical points. In the event of any technical difficulties, you may dial 1-800-263-6317 to reach GoToWebinar's technical support line. Also, if for any reason you happen to lose connectivity during the webinar, please go ahead and log back in and rejoin us. At any point during the webinar, you may type your questions for our presenters in the questions box on your screen, indicated here. We will do our best to answer them throughout the presentations. We will be live tweeting today's webinar and encourage you to do the same using the hashtag PredictSuccess. Our Twitter handles are @CCRSCenter and @AYPF_tweets. Finally, please note that the slides and a recording of today's session will be available on the CCRS Center website as well as AYPF's website. I'd like you to join me in welcoming today's presenters, who are listed here in the order that they will present. I will introduce each presenter in greater detail before they speak, and we will be pausing throughout the webinar to answer your questions, so don't forget to type them into the questions box. Please note that our presenters' contact information and PowerPoint slides will be posted online at www.aypf.org and www.ccrscenter.org in a few days following today's webinar. First, I'd like to introduce Joseph Harris, the Director of the College and Career Readiness and Success Center at AIR, who will be describing the center and its efforts related to predictors of postsecondary success. Joe?
Thanks, Jennifer, and welcome to both our presenters and participants. For those of you who are new to our webinar series, the College and Career Readiness and Success Center, which is housed at AIR, is part of a network of federally funded comprehensive centers that provide technical assistance and resources to our regional partners and the states they serve on key educational reform issues. The American Youth Policy Forum, our co-host today, is a lead partner of the CCRS Center. As a technical assistance hub, we also collaborate with other federal and external centers and the CCRS resource providers to promote knowledge development, dissemination, and application through technology-based activities such as this webinar today. Next slide, please. As part of this work, the CCRS Center recently released an updated College and Career Readiness and Success Organizer that incorporates feedback and insights provided by experts representing the diverse CCRS stakeholder communities, including workforce, career and technical education, and community colleges. Next slide. The organizer is intended to be a comprehensive and visual representation of the complexities of the college and career readiness and success universe, and provides a consolidated overview of the many elements that impact a learner's ability to succeed in college and careers at both the institutional and individual levels. Next. For today's webinar on workforce data, we will be focused on the outcomes and measures strand of the organizer that includes separate threads for on-track indicators for readiness, measures of post-secondary readiness, and measures of post-secondary success. Please. Next. To assist CCRS stakeholders with a better understanding of outcomes and measures, our center has also released the brief Predictors of Postsecondary Success, which summarizes early childhood through early post-secondary education research to identify student skills, behaviors, and other characteristics that predict future academic and workplace success. Next. The brief is organized to catalog measures at specific phases across the PK20 spectrum and also describes the variety of types of measures available. A primary recommendation of the brief is to continue building comprehensive, user-friendly state, district, and school data systems that allow data linkages across pre-kindergarten to workforce. Our presenters today will be sharing some exciting examples of how they are making this happen. Next. In closing, I invite you to visit the CCRS Center website to access both of these publications, as well as an interactive version of the organizer and other CCRS resources and activities that may be of interest to you and your colleagues. We look forward to this and other opportunities to share knowledge and build understandings about key CCRS topics and issues. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Joe, for that overview. And now I'd like to introduce our next presenter. Rachel Zinn is the director of the Workforce Data Quality Campaign, or WDQC. Before joining WDQC, Rachel spent 5 years as a program analyst in education in the labor branches of the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, where she provided policy analysis on post-secondary education and workforce development and organized multi-agency efforts to enhance data linkages. Rachel?
Hello, thank you so much for the invitation to join this webinar today. So what I'm going to do is basically introduce workforce data, what it is, and talk about what it can be used for. Next slide. First, I'm going to talk a little bit just about the Workforce Data Quality Campaign and who we are. So it is our mission to advocate for inclusive, aligned, and market-relevant education and workforce data systems. We work at both the federal and state levels, advocating for useful information for policymakers, students and workers, business leaders, and educators. At the state level, we have a blueprint that guides our reform efforts that has 13 key features of a high-quality data infrastructure. I'm going to be talking about some elements of that blueprint today. In addition, at the federal level, we work with agencies to and Congress to think about how to strengthen federal legislation, funding for data systems, and technical assistance. So a policy agenda has been developed by a broad coalition of national organizations, state leaders, and technical experts who represent a variety of interests across the workforce spectrum. And in particular, our 11 national partners are instrumental in continuing to evolve and promote our policy agenda, and you can see our national partners on the screen. We are foundation funded. Next slide. And our funders, we greatly appreciate their support: the Apollo Education Group, the Joyce Foundation, and Lumina Foundation. So first I want to talk a little bit about what is workforce data. The Workforce Data Quality Campaign takes a relatively expansive view of what that encompasses. You'll most often hear people talking about workforce data. What they really mean is what we call employment data. So there are two major sources of employment data which basically show the employment status and earnings of individuals. So the first source is unemployment UI wage records, and UI wage records are submitted quarterly by employers to the state agencies in each state that manage the unemployment insurance benefits. So usually that's the state workforce agency. And these records include basic information about the employee and employer, including the industry of the employer, but not the occupation of the employee, which some of my colleagues will talk about later. And they also show the wages that an individual earned in the most recent quarter. The other source of employment data is tax records. So in addition to the UI wage records, all employers annually submit a W-2 form to the Internal Revenue Service that contains information on employers and individuals and has annual earnings. So W-2 data isn't kept at the state level, that's at the federal level. In addition to employment data, there is workforce program data. So there's many programs designed to help workers find employment or build skills to advance their careers. These programs are supported by state and federal funds very frequently, and so they have requirements to report to the government on their outcomes and their inputs. Programs might include the Career and Technical Education, Adult Education, Workforce Investment Act programs, apprenticeship. So the data that these programs have to report often includes things like the demographics of program participants, the services and financial assistance they receive, and the credentials and employment they attain. The next type of data is occupational credentials. So it's very common for especially state data systems to have information on degrees and certificates awarded by post-secondary institutions. What is less common is for them to contain credentials that are awarded by state licensing boards or by industry, which are certifications. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about occupational credentials later. Finally, I do want to note labor market information that provides a picture of current and future job openings and sometimes information about skill requirements for those jobs. So most labor market information is gathered through surveys, such as those conducted by the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, as well as state agencies. In addition, some labor market information uses data from tax records or other kind of mandatory data reporting like the kind that we talked about with workforce program data. And finally, real-time labor market information, also called online job ad info, gives a snapshot of the current labor market by actually kind of scraping information from online job ads and online resume databases to show what's really happening in the labor market right now. So, next slide. Where does all this data come together? The main place it comes together is in state data systems. So state longitudinal data systems are key in allowing different types of workforce data to be linked and connected to other types of data like education and social services data. These systems contain longitudinal data, which means that they include data about individuals over time. So these systems allow us to see what programs, individually or in combination, can help people access employment and higher earnings over their careers. Next slide. And I do want to make a few notes about privacy. These longitudinal data systems can sound a little scary when we talk about being able to follow individuals, but there are a lot of privacy protections in place to make sure that that information stays confidential. So there's different ways to structure state longitudinal data systems, but all states work to protect the privacy of individuals. Often data from different types of programs is kept separate and only linked at specific times or to answer certain policy questions. So it's on an as-needed basis. In addition, there is restricted access to individual linked data. It's only available to employees and researchers who sign agreements to keep the data confidential. And finally, data released to the public is only in aggregate form, so it shows information about groups of students or workers, not individuals. And states, in fact, have rules about the minimum size of a group so that members of the public can't combine different data sources and figure out facts about specific individuals. Next. So every state has a longitudinal data system. These systems started largely at the K-12 level and have since expanded to include early childhood, post-secondary, and workforce data. So one of the things that WDQC does is to survey states to assess their progress on our 13 blueprint elements. We're about halfway through surveying the states and hoping to get the rest done in the next few months. But I wanted to note just a few areas where we're seeing very good progress and a few areas for improvement. So places where a lot of states are doing well is interagency data governance. It's very important to have different state agencies come together so that they can make these linkages across programs and agencies and answer complex policy questions about how people are faring through education and the workforce over time. State funding support. A lot of states have dedicated state funding streams to maintain these systems. And finally, assessing employment outcomes. That's an item I'm going to talk about in just a moment. But a lot of states are seeing the importance of being able to measure the employment outcomes for graduates of a variety of higher education and workforce development programs. Areas for improvement, measuring non-degree credentials, industry validation. So that's all about making sure that the credentials that are being issued by the post-secondary system are really recognizing and certifying skills that employers need. And that can, the alignment between curriculum and employer needs can often be obtained by involving employers in the curriculum development and having them validate that these credentials have what they need. And finally, skills gap analysis, being able to look at the supply and demand of labor for certain occupations and identify places where the state may have an oversupply or may have a shortage of workers. So I'd want to talk a little bit more about assessing employment outcomes. So WDQC believes that we should be able to measure the outcomes for all education and training programs for transparency, if not for accountability and program funding. That may not always be appropriate, but we should at least always know the outcomes. So there's state laws that support this kind of framework. For example, New Jersey requires all training providers and for-profit career schools to share student records with the state so they can be matched with the wage records. There's also federal policies that are moving us towards this vision. The Gainful Employment Rule, which Department of Education is planning to issue the final regulation in October. So the Gainful Employment Rule basically measures debt-to-income ratio for career-oriented programs. So that starts, in order to get the debt-to-income ratio, you of course need income. So they do calculations of median earnings for each program. Finally, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which is the bill it passed overwhelmingly in the Senate yesterday and is on to the House. That is the bill to reauthorize the Workforce Investment Act. That requires providers that get funding through WIOA programs to report employment outcomes for all of their students. So a lot of states are reporting these employment outcomes through data sharing agreements with their state workforce agencies and matching with UI wage records through a couple of key data elements like social security number, name, and birthday. So UI wage records are the most common source, but it's problematic to only have data sharing agreements within a state. You don't capture people who are working in a different state from where they were trained. So especially for schools in border regions or programs that prepare people for booming industries in other states, they end up missing a lot of the outcomes for their students. So there's kind of two mechanisms for cross-state sharing of employment data. The first is the the Wage Record Interchange System, RIS. And there's also a second version of that, RIS-2. And this is a system set up by the Department of Labor and it's not a national database, it's actually just kind of a processing system that allows states to query each other and send in social security numbers to let other states know that, okay, we're missing this person in our records, we need your records if you have them, and compiles all the records from other states and sends them back to the requesting state. So it's basically a clearinghouse type process. The other mechanism for getting national data is using the tax data held by the Social Security Administration. So that's what the Gainful Employment Rule does. The Department of Education actually matches their student records with SSA tax data in order to get median earnings. Next. So next thing I want to talk about is industry recognized credentials. And this is a place where a lot of states are very interested in expanding their data systems to include these type of credentials, but it's been a struggle so far. So the diverse credentials can include licenses and certifications, and as I mentioned earlier, they're not usually in state systems because they're not issued through post-secondary institutions. So licenses, it's usually controlled by a state licensing board, and that's not often linked into the state longitudinal data system. Certifications are generally given for a particular occupation by an industry board or an employer, and because that data is held by these kind of third-party entities, again, they're not usually in the state systems. So some recent state efforts to incorporate this kind of data in their systems, there's been a pilot, Illinois in 2012 partnered with CompTIA, which is a trade association that provides information technology certifications to explore ways to match individual level certification data with other education and workforce program data. This project was successful in matching certification data with student records from Illinois community colleges, and they could analyze the characteristics of students who took and passed the certification tests. So that was a way for them to see how well the community college courses were actually preparing students for the certification exams. They also matched data to wage records to look at the earnings of the certification holders to see if those certifications were making a difference for workers. The pilot's working to expand, and they are hoping to involve about 8 states, and CompTIA is also working in partnership with the U.S. Department of Education and the Association of Career and Technical Education to get that done. I also want to mention the Workforce Credentials Coalition, and this is a group of community colleges led by schools from North Carolina and California, and they're working on how to reach out to a broader set of industry partners to match this kind of data. And finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about skills gaps analysis. So this is a way to kind of bring a lot of this data together that we've talked about and really use it to influence policy. So once data systems are capturing all types of credentials, they can look at their education pipeline to see what the supply is of workers with particular skills or levels of education. This supply can then be compared to the current or projected demand for occupations found in labor market information like surveys or online job ads. So comparing supply and demand helps to identify places where the state's education system may not be meeting employer needs. So for example, you see in this chart based on data from Washington State that there are a few particular occupations where clearly the projected demand is exceeding the supply of students who are coming out of school with the kinds of credentials needed. So this is a place where colleges and state policymakers may want to change direction. And that is it for me. So I know that was a lot of information quickly, so I'm happy to answer questions.
Well, Rachel, thanks so much. That really provided such a great overview of what is workforce data and where states are. There have been a number of questions that come in, and I just want to remind our audience listening today that you can type your questions into the questions box, and we are monitoring it, and we'll be sure to ask them to our presenters. So just a couple questions for you right now, Rachel. You mentioned a number of the privacy protections that are in place around use of this data, and I understand many folks do have concerns around privacy, but I'm wondering if you could tell us maybe some of the other barriers that perhaps are preventing use of workforce data or linkage of workforce data to other data systems.
Sure. So there are some technical challenges, especially in directly linking K-12 data with employment data, because the UI wage records are based on Social Security numbers, and that's really the unique identifier. But a lot of K-12 systems either don't through practice or are not allowed to collect Social Security numbers. There's not kind of a reliable, unique identifier to link those two. So some states have experimented with sort of, they call it probabilistic matching, and it's basically kind of statistical algorithms to use other pieces of information, but make sure that you're using it in such a way that John Smith, who graduated from Heights High, is the same John Smith who is now working at the welding plant down the street. So they've been able to do that using a couple different data sources. Some of them have also brought in Department of Motor Vehicles data in order, because it's kind of can be geographically reliable, and use that in some of their models. So states are getting creative on how to do that. That's the biggest technical challenge, I think. There's also a lot of, so in addition to the privacy protections and common sense, there's a lot of privacy laws governing how this data can be shared. There's the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, which strictly governs how education student data can be shared. There's a lot of federal regulations about the UI wage records and how those can be shared. So linking them up, often it's even when kind of the common sense test of privacy is met, there can still be legal challenges with meeting all of these requirements and linking up the data.
Great, and sort of following along to that, folks have a lot of questions about whether or not you're able to pull information by specific populations. So for example, can you see information of employment outcomes for students with disabilities?
So that depends. If the K-12 data has it, then you would be able in theory to do that. So, and it's also a matter of convince. So, all right, sorry. So I'm trying to think about how the best way to answer this. So there's also logistical challenges because, so for example, if there was a state school district that wanted to look at their employment outcomes for just students with disabilities, they would get aggregate data back from their state longitudinal data system or directly from their state workforce agency if they have a direct linkage and matching agreement for the UI wage records. So the first thing is the K-12 data would have to have the disability information, which I believe it does. It's required for, Department of Education reporting. They have all of that information. So they could kind of slice and dice by students with disabilities. They'd have to have a big enough group of students so that it wasn't, as I said, violating kind of that N size requirement. So, if there's 5 students with disabilities, the state may decide that's too few. People could figure out who those students are. If there's 50, no, probably not. So we'll give you the group, the group average for that 50. So you're usually dealing with averages, but yeah, I think theoretically it would definitely be possible to get that data. It just depends on the original kind of unit records and what demographic data is in there.
Well, thanks for that. It sounds like it's quite a complicated process, but really could be helpful and definitely sparked a lot of conversation and interest among folks tuned in today. So just one final question for you, but before we move on, and a reminder to folks that we will do our best to get to all of your questions, and those that we aren't able to get to, we will follow up with you and either connect you with someone or answer them on the CCRS Center blog. But folks are very interested in the Workforce Credential Coalition that you mentioned was being run by the community colleges or community college systems in California and North Carolina. Can you talk a little bit more about the roles that the community colleges are playing and what their goal is through the coalition?
Sure. So especially for community colleges, they're really interested in getting data on certifications that are awarded by industry. A big piece of the business of community colleges is offering non-credit programs. So these are programs that don't get credit, but it's maybe short-term training or upskilling classes. But until now, they've basically gotten the schools, not the students, have gotten no credit for their non-credit because there's no degree or certificate at the end to point to and say, okay, our students, completed this and learned this. So they're especially interested in getting certification data to be able to say, okay, but these non-credit courses prepared these students to succeed on the certification exam that's important to industry. So the data, getting the data is really important for them to be able to show outcomes. So they're trying to work, especially here in Washington, D.C., they're trying to work with some of the large industry associations and think about ways that they might be able to share the data. They are thinking about trying to kind of set up a national system to do that. They're just in the very early phases of thinking that through and what that would look like and what the legal framework would be.
Thanks, and I'm sure folks can follow up with you if they're interested in learning more about the efforts to date. So I want to move on to our next presenter, but remind folks that we will have plenty of time for your questions at the end. Joshua Holloway is currently an associate professor in the John Glenn School at The Ohio State University. He's also the director of the Ohio Education Research Center, a collaboration of 6 Ohio universities and 4 research organizations aimed at bridging research, policy, and practice around education in the state of Ohio, preschool through workforce. In addition, Josh also serves as the associate director of the Center for Human Resource Research at Ohio State University. And he is quite busy, but I'm thrilled to be able to welcome him to today's session. Josh?
Thank you very much. I want to just thank the organizers for putting this together. I think it's a fine panel, and I'm learning a lot as well. I want to start off, and I'm going to the second slide, just by showing who we are, the different partners that are involved in the OERC. And then, what I'm going to start with early on is kind of a perspective about really how you're using data in our current system to link school and work. And I think it's really important to you can go to the next slide. Important part here is remembering that we're moving from a relatively static view nationally of kind of additive high school plus college equals work to one where there's a really dynamic view of skill development over the life course, and that it's not just individuals in high school and in college who are in need of workforce data to figure out where best to go next in terms of their training and what kinds of careers will pay off. So there's this really dynamic nature of it, and that is driving a lot of the tool development that states, I would say, are going after, where there's a lot of dashboards in addition to being focused on kind of issues of program evaluation as we have been kind of traditionally. Go to the next slide, please. It's just a word view that kind of helps you see some of the complexity of the items that we're dealing with. And the next slide, please. So just thinking about this in one example, the STEM, what I call the kind of STEM workforce here, which often comes into debate at the state level. This is a visualization from the Business Higher Ed Forum, which we did not do, but which friends of mine did. And it shows really the stocks kind of that are coming in out of high school and potential leaks out of the system of training as we end up in the top right-hand corner with graduates going into industry or teaching or in STEM. At each level, you'll note that in K through 12 or higher ed, you end up with loss or what we call leakage out of the system. Individual students who really decide they're not interested in STEM or not qualified or both. The implications are really twofold. That one, that we can figure out with data where the systems and the pipes are leaky and where we need to fix them. So where kids are, for example, not being successful. And that two, that we can predict, and I put predict in quotes here, in some fashion, where kids are going and what jobs will be available. And those are really critical kinds of things. So I just wanted to note the complexity of the situation as we start here. So now I'm going to issues of data resources. And I'm going to start with, again, kind of a visual representation of this. If you just click through to the first view. So traditionally, we've thought of data in 4 big domains: workforce, education, higher ed, and potentially family or health data. And these are all kind of isolated or kind of siloed systems, as you can see from the white space in between them. However, and click forward, please. And again, yeah. So as we see, basically we're operating now with a view that all data are kind of embedded, and therefore that helps us answer really important questions. So, some questions we get asked a lot are, how many of our adult literacy completers enter college, or how many people are being trained in welding in Ohio across all of our different programs? Well, you can't really answer that in a siloed system. You have to answer it in a comprehensive data system that has testing and has K through 12 data and has workforce data all together. So going to the next slide, I'm going to give you kind of a sense of some of our examples, but first I want to reiterate what Rachel was saying earlier. I mean, there are formal governance structures, and we've been very successful, really thanks to the people from the Workforce Data Quality Initiative at the Department of Labor and putting together legal agreements at the state level that help us support our data requests. We're very successful at connecting researchers with government needs and objectives. So the Ohio Ed Research Center has a lot of time spent with agencies putting together an agenda that the agencies themselves want to answer. So the data are used for a real purpose, and I think that's another really important thing here. The governance structure we have provides support on 3 really critical issues: what data we choose to archive, how you can adjudicate data requests and approvals. So we interact very directly with the data providers so that researchers are not working on their own without supervision. The last thing is we really have, because of our cross-agency nature, means the government as a whole is involved so that you can achieve objectives that the governor's office, for example, is trying to achieve, or that groups of agencies are working on, which means we can add more value. So I just want to point out that the data systems themselves require this level of integration. So going forward, now to the interesting kind of stuff. We're going to talk about 2 examples here. One is a project we're working on for the Ohio Governor's Office, Governor Kasich's Office of Workforce Transformation. And if you go to the next slide, you know, we're talking about some big questions here and answering them with the governor's office over time by developing a dashboard tool. And the dashboard tool is designed to answer some of these questions, you know, really kind of 1, 2, and 4. How well are the programs doing? What happens after people finish? And does business get any direct value from the workforce system? These are all very critical public policy questions, and there's a lot of interest in developing tools. So if you go to the next slide, the strategic plan for the Office of Workforce Transformation, which is in Ohio's governor's office, has this development of a dashboard system to support business in meeting its workforce needs. We're the contractor to help with that. This performance metrics, if you go to the next slide, they're in 5 domains: skills gains, entered employment, average wages, repeat customers, and then business penetration. And they all, you know, by looking at the specific examples, you get a sense of the kinds of questions we're trying to answer. And some of these have been around for a long time in different federal or state legislative rules. But what we're doing, and if you go to the next slide, you'll see this, we're trying to answer these questions for very large federal programs at the state level at the same time. So we're providing the same measures for each of these statutory programs. And I think that's unique in some ways. So going to the next slide. So the way the reporting system works that we're designing, we have kind of reports that are at the county level, at the program level, at the regional level. And in Ohio, we have a series of economic development regions that are critical. And then to the extent possible where providers differ from other jurisdictions. So in other words, where there's more providers than one in a county than one, you know, you can see provider reports. And this is all, of course, subject to the rules Rachel said about cell sizes, so we don't violate those rules. And go to the next one. So what I'm going to do is take you through a little journey here as pretend that you are the county commissioner from, say, Stark County. If you go to the next slide, it'll show you where Stark County is. So it's up there on your Akron. And the important part about this is we're going to look at, say, maybe we're interested in the Workforce Investment Act. And there's a summary report that we can provide to the county commissioner or anyone else who will be interested in this on each of the 5 kind of 6 measures. And it has standardized measures. You're not supposed to be able to read this. This is just to give you a sense of what the visual image will look like on the screen that you'll be able to zoom in on. But you basically see all of these different indicators. Each county is compared to its region and the state average, and you get a green, yellow, or red if it's necessary to show the trend, and the arrows can point in different directions. So there's a comprehensiveness of it and a similarity. At the top, you'll get a kind of a representation of the jurisdiction, the county or the region's basic labor market and employment characteristics. Go to the next one, please. So we're drilling in here on the kind of get jobs metric for the county, for Stark County, of the 605 completers from 2010 to 2011. They've performed rather well in terms of employment 2 quarters out, short-term employment gains, and this is kind of better than the state or the region as a whole. So how did they which program is providing this degree of success? I think we all know that youth and adult programs have different kinds of outcomes, different profiles. So going to the next slide provides really a better perspective. So if I'm the county administrator, I might know that our youth programs don't do as well historically in terms of employment outcomes. But I might not know that may be dragging down my kind of average. So in other words, if I looked at the Workforce Investment Act employment outcomes as a whole, losses in terms of employment outcomes for youth, are offset in some ways by very high and very positive employment outcomes in comparison to the region and the state as a whole for the adult and dislocated worker programs. But I might ask also, are there other counties or states around, regions around me that are doing better? So if you go to the next slide, you get a kind of a nifty visual image that shows, well, if I'm the Stark County Commissioner, I might want to go talk to somebody in, say, Lake County or Trumbull to ask, what are you doing better, and why are you above the regional average, whereas I'm below? And so that is, if on one metric, some of the visualizations that you'll be able to get. These will be available really for all of the different programs that we specified earlier. And so, for example, if you go to the next slide, just showing you an example of longer-term employment outcomes, you get an instance of keeping jobs over time. So this again shows you that for that same 605 completers, that Stark County is still doing a little bit better than the region or the state. So, and then finally, going to the next one, we're just able to kind of see earnings outcomes, and this is for both of those two employment or periods, the second and the fourth quarter. And you can see the traditional bump that happens when people are employed longer. So this is just an example of the kind of employment reporting and performance reporting we're doing with Ohio's Governor's Office, and we really look forward to providing the whole suite of program outcomes for the state over time. So I'm going to turn now to a second example, which is more analytical, more retrospective in some ways, and this is an example of employment outcomes for higher education graduates. So what we've done here is we've taken a set of graduates, we've linked the graduates to their employers through wage records, as Rachel described, many states do, and we've linked employers to industries. So now I'm just showing you the next slide here, and if you just click the little button, please. This is a visualization that shows you over the decade between 2000 and 2009 how the percentage of graduates by field of study has changed in Ohio's public sector over time. And as you can see, over the decade, individuals from business and social science and humanities continue to grow and be the largest number of graduates in Ohio over time. In contrast, some of the STEM fields really have have stagnated in terms of their production in the state. Education graduates seem to be fairly consistent, and that's something we wanted to follow up on. So if you look at the next slide, you see, well, you know, a reasonable policy question we always want to know is what happens to people who graduate in the field? Do they end up working in the field for which they're trained? And in Ohio, we've been able to answer this using the state records we maintain. And as you can see, you know, kind of 80, let's see, of the graduates from 2009, majority of them were employed in education industry a year later. And I think that's a really important point to make, and is something that's been interesting to talk with agencies about. Similarly, if you go to the next slide, you can see kind of over time the numerical kind of the quantity of people who've graduated in education and working in the education sector 1 year after graduation, and how it stays at about 4,000 in elementary and secondary school hiring on an annual basis over time, which gives you some comfort in some ways about the stability of employment for this sector. Going to the next slide, we talked a little bit about earnings, and this is kind of an example of how quarterly data are used to illustrate kind of the payoff to a college degree. And in this case, you really see that being employed in education, the field for which you're trained, is highly remunerative in comparison to being employed in another sector that you end up working in. So people who are employed in education and were trained in education make more, roughly $40,000 in 2009. And then the last visual image I want to show you, which really is trickier to explain, but I'm gonna try. This slide close is based on a kind of an open source tool. It shows clustering for college graduates in 2009 by industry of employment. On the right-hand side of the circle, people are represented by a major, such as health. And on the top and the left, they're represented by industry, such as education and health. So industry and education codes are not the same thing. For this, we can see that education and health programs produce people that tend to work in the industry they were trained for, hence the thick lines for green and yellow. And in contrast, business, for example, the orange on the right-hand side, spreads out to many different industries. You have, you know, trade and education and industry. You've got really business going into all the sectors. This is very useful as a thought tool for policymakers to try to figure out what's bothering them about this employment outcomes changing by industry sector. So those are the examples I have to share from the Ohio Education Research Center, and I will welcome your questions, and thank you again.
Josh, thanks for that really comprehensive presentation, and there's so much going on in Ohio. We really appreciate you pulling out some examples. One question to build on the last visualization that you showed us is really to understand, does the Ohio Education Research Center also provide training to folks to utilize the reports that you've helped to build, or help them build the capacity to use this information to drive decision making?
So we have regular conferences at which we've provided both technical training on accessing the data for state agencies that are legally allowed to do so, and we've also provided training for researchers who want to apply and access the research files in a de-identified form. In terms of more specifically for, say, the Workforce Success Measures tool, there are plans to provide kind of comprehensive support for users who are required to access that data for their job, and that's part of what the OERC is working with the different state agencies on.
Thanks, and I want you to know that there are a lot of Ohio Buckeye fans out there right now. I'm proud that you are sharing the work going on in Ohio. But just to ask a little bit more about the data, folks noticed that most of the information that you had only went up to 2009. Can you talk a little bit about why there's the lag in the data reporting?
There isn't that big a lag. I chose to provide some information that is more fully developed for the purposes of illustration. But the questioner raised a really important point about using employment or workforce data to evaluate statutory programs. The data themselves are collected, and then there is about a year and a half lag before you can fully process them and use them. So they're really not suited for just-in-time adjustment of, say, labor supply, or just-in-time production for community colleges to figure out what to offer next term, for example.
Thanks, and I think that leads to another question, which is, are you considering adding data gathered from students or workers in to have a little bit more of their voice overlaid in some of the data and visualizations that you've been creating?
That's a really interesting question. There is some discussion about surveys of employers specifically to get at the issues of involvement with the workforce system. However, we have no plans to interview workers directly or students directly. That would be a very complicated request.
Understand, and especially given some of the challenges around privacy and desire to keep the information de-identified. So I want to remind folks in the audience that we will have time at the end for some of your questions, but I want to keep us moving as we have another presenter joining us today, and I want to go ahead and introduce him and also remind our audience that we are tweeting today's webinar, and you can join the conversation by using the hashtag #PredictSuccess, and encourage you to follow the Twitter accounts of both the CCRS Center and AYPF. So our next presenter, Bill Hurwitch, serves as the director of the statewide longitudinal data system for the Maine Department of Education. He's been working for the department for 11 years, managing the implementation of multiple data systems, including the Maine Education Data Management System and its complementary financial system, as well as the Adult Education Management System and the Educator Credentialing System. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Bill.
Thank you, Jennifer. What I'm going to show and demonstrate today is the results of work completed under 2 federal grants, the 2009 ARRA Longitudinal Data System Grant and the Round 1 of the Workforce Data Quality Initiative. This is a joint effort of the Department of Education along with the Department of Labor, Center for Workforce Research and Information, and in partnership with our 2 university systems, the University of Maine system and the Maine Community College system. We can go to the next slide. Our focus was really on the use of data. We wanted to make sure that not just the agency folks and the post-secondary got access to the data, but we made sure that it was a public interface, and that's what I'll be showing today. For the college-going decision-making, the high school guidance counselors, other organizations that help students transition from high school to college are very much involved in this. Post-secondary programs, what they've found is this system is replacing surveys. It's providing much more accurate and timely data, and they're getting better results for determining programs and policies. For educational research, our primary research arm is the Maine Education Policy Research Institute. That is actually made up of researchers from 2 of our universities. And it was formed by the legislature about 20 years ago. It provides research not only for the legislature, but also for the Department of Education. And they are a partner in our grant program. Economic development information for business community and other community groups. They'll be able to use this data for determining what kind of degrees that we're offering, what kind of outcomes there are from those degrees, number of graduates, and some geographical information as well. We also included the teacher preparation programs. There's 16 programs in our post-secondary institutions to provide teachers to Maine education. And then the adult education program, looking at post-secondary and workforce outcomes. The resources that we use, the top 4 come from Department of Education data systems. These include our statewide student data system for the K-12 data, the staff data system, and the education credentialing system provide data on anybody who is employed by our public school system. This comes right down from superintendents through teachers and other administrators and staff who are working in our schools. Adult education system, again, is done out of the Department of Education. For the post-secondary, we focused on our 2 college systems. University of Maine system are the 7 4-year institutions, and the Maine Community College system are the 7 2-year institutions in Maine. For the Department of Labor, they set up under the grant programs the wage records matching system, and it's primarily using, at least initially, the unemployment insurance database, but we are looking into expanding that into RIS2 and FedES to get out-of-state as well as federal employment data. And the National Student Clearinghouse, the Department of Education actually holds the contract. We consolidated the use of the National Student Clearinghouse data so we could provide under one contract information for the high schools, for the post-secondary programs, for the workforce, and for adult education. Go to the next slide. What I'm going to be showing is the wage outcome reports. This is a public website. It's not live yet. It's still in test mode. We do plan on rolling out this summer. I'll actually be doing a live demo at the NCES Stats DC conference in Washington in the end of July. We are meeting as a group between Department of Labor, Education, and the college systems to do some planning for the rollout, make sure that we're all coming through with a consistent message. It's a lot of data to push out there into the public, and we want to make sure that it's being used correctly and people aren't misinterpreting the data. We had a number of questions. Similar to what Josh showed, is you just really start with the research questions when you're building these systems. Do the program completers get jobs in Maine? And this system is just focused on Maine alone. We're not looking at jobs outside of Maine. What do those jobs pay? And if the outcomes vary by degree, institution, and area of study. Stakeholders, it's a wide range of stakeholders from the general public. As I mentioned, the high schools and the post-secondary. Policymakers are getting involved in this, as well as the business community. So next slide. This is the opening screen when you log into this. We actually don't log in. This is actually the public system. We started with wage data. The decision was to really, that was of the greatest interest to the general public, and with degree information. Again, this is Maine only. You'll see tabs at the top where you can start drilling into colleges and areas of study, and I'll show those screens. We started with first-year wages. We can go back. I'm not quite there yet. We started with the first-year wages, and when we talk about first-year wages, we decided not to go quarterly. We started to pick quarters 3 through 6 to determine an annual wage, and that was a request from the post-secondary institutions. They felt the public would relate more to an annual wage rate than a quarterly wage rate. So we took 3 through 6, and what we started the system with are 3 academic years of data. So this is a combination of 2009, 10, and 11 data. All the data in the system is exportable to Excel and PDF. We want people to use the data, not just look at it. One of the challenges with this screen was to consolidate the degree programs. We found when you're dealing with multiple post-secondary systems as well as institutions, they all have a different way of naming their degrees. So this is a consolidated look. We're trying to get it down even further because the descriptions are going to vary. So now we can go to the next slide. The first slide I'm showing you is looking at just one of the systems, University of Maine system. This is in graph mode. You can also do tables as well, especially when you're exporting to Excel. Not looking at the areas of study, but just looking at the credential types. So this will just give you some idea. We can draw down to the individual schools and look at how they mapped into this, and then work further there right into the areas of studies within the schools. Next slide. In this slide is where I started to drill down into one particular degree. In this case, I selected again for the University of Maine system, just a bachelor's degree. And there's a lot of data on this. You can see from the scroll bar on the right, this goes down quite a bit to programs, but we want to focus on which ones are providing the highest wages. As you can see, most are STEM. There are some health in here as well. But people can actually go down and look at the different degree programs and areas of study and really get some good idea of where the wages are in Maine throughout not only the whole university system, but again, they can drill down to the universities. Next slide. And this one, I took it from a different point of view. This is actually number of graduates. Under the number of completers, there are actually different choices. I selected here just number of completers. This is not necessarily the ones that go into the wages. You have three choices here: number and percentage of completers in a degree program, number and percentage of people who show any wages, and the number of people who are contributing to the annual wage numbers that are shown in the system. Where this is helpful, and I was meeting with a group of guidance people yesterday, they were interested in, okay, we have a number of completers in a particular degree program. How many of them actually stay in Maine and get a full year's worth of wages? And this will help look at, are we exporting certain degrees? Are we retaining other degree programs? Good information for industry. Again, we can look at it both system-wide, degree, and college-wide. Next screen, please. This is where I clicked on the Area Study tab, and I drilled down using CIP code for health professions and related programs, and then selected just on one area of study, nursing. From somebody looking at this, a student can look at what programs are available, where they're available in Maine, both in associate and bachelor's degrees, and look at the different wages, number of completers in each group. And what we found with this one is you're looking at the highest wage, University of Maine, that's our central campus, that's up in central Maine. University of Southern Maine is in the Portland area, both areas where there are major medical centers. But one of the things that really did show is there's not a lot of geographical difference, that a nursing degree pays well no matter where you are in a rural state like Maine. So it's good information. Again, you don't have to be in the near the major medical centers, at least getting their degree anywhere from northern down east Maine and be able to pull in the good wages. Next study. Next slide, please. Here I drilled down to a single institution. I selected University of Maine in Farmington. This is the four-year university that provides the largest number of teachers to our system. They offer two different degree programs. As you can see, it's very heavily education-oriented. And again, showing which of the education areas of study provide the greatest return, and also showing the value of getting a master's degree in education. You can go to the next slide. The adult education outcome reports, we're using similar data, but we are looking at post-secondary matriculation. One of our focus areas was tracking high school dropouts into the colleges and into the workforce. Our directors of our adult ed programs feel that these are motivated students. They don't have to go and get a high school diploma through adult ed, but they go ahead and work through the program, and they wanted to see how well they did, both in going on to college and into the job market. We also use the system to look at individual programs offered through adult ed, like Work Ready and other programs, follow those students. We're able to do the linkage because adult ed does collect the Social Security number, and we also match it with our state student identifier. Anybody who's in an academic program in adult ed, we go and we share data with the statewide student information system, see if they did get education in the K-12 system in Maine, and then we can match them up and give feedback. So that's been one of the big advantages of being able to link our department programs here. Next slide. The teacher prep programs, actually all this data is coming through the Department of Education systems. I mentioned there's 16 programs in Maine of colleges, both public and private, providing teachers. We're using our staff system as well as our credentialing system to answer questions about where their graduates are employed in Maine schools. And we also have a lot of mobility, so it's not necessarily just their graduates, it's students who attended at least part of the time in one of the degree granting institutions. But we also flag the institution where they get their certification. We can follow and see what subjects areas they're teaching, whether they've received any additional endorsements or credentials while teaching, as well as additional education. And we also have salary data both on administrators and teachers. Part of our success to this program is really getting the post-secondary institutions, Department of Education, to work as a team on this. They're giving us data, we're giving them outcome reports. Where they want to go with it is to look at teacher effectiveness, and this is part of the CAPE accreditation standards that are new. They want to not only find out where their graduates are going, are they staying in Maine, but how well they are doing. And that's something that we're going to start to build over the next few years as we build out the system. Slide, please. So some of the things we've learned from this, the stakeholders, and when I mention stakeholders, it's just about everybody, from the guidance counselors to the post-secondary community groups, policymakers, all have been very enthusiastic having seen the system, giving us a lot of good feedback. We had some challenges, though, in putting it together. When you're dealing with multiple post-secondary systems, multiple state agencies, trying to get the systems to work together and then get the resources to work on the systems is a challenge, but we were able to work through it over the last couple of years. And of course, the other challenge is the stakeholders, once they started to see the data, they started looking for more data. And as you heard from Josh, we're looking at occupational data, out-of-state data. We're hoping to bring that in. In some cases where we're not able to find out, are they actually working where their degree came from? As Josh showed in his last slide, when it comes to education and healthcare, you have a pretty good idea that they're staying in that industry. But because we can't look at occupational data, we are just looking at degree data at this point, but we want to move forward from that. Next slide. Some of the challenges, collecting Social Security numbers, as Rachel had mentioned, that's a big area for us. We started with legislation, which actually was very helpful when we started the grant, but unfortunately we lost some of that information. The legislature got hit with a lot of stakeholders. They came back and said, maybe using Social Security numbers out of the K-12 system wasn't such a good idea, so they overturned that law. And that resistance came from the Maine ACLU, the Maine School Management, the Teachers Union, and a lot of other people are just very concerned about protecting the privacy of the high school students. Not as big an issue when you get into adult ed and post-secondary. So as a result, we have very little information on high schools. Most of it comes from survey as well as career and technical education. Not really reliable data, so we're not publishing any of that at this point. But our hope is that we can start to pull in some more accurate data down the road. Some of the other things were stakeholder concerns. They want to make sure that the data is interpreted correctly. The post-secondary institutions are concerned about, are people going to be focusing on the programs, not on the outcomes? And in talking to some of our stakeholders who've seen the system, they're really focusing on the opportunities, and which is very positive. And then the last slide. One of the things that came out of this was some legislation, and this was led by the House Majority Leader, who is also the chair of the Workforce Committee in the legislature, working with John Doerr, who helped start this program, along with the Department of Education and the Department of Labor, with strong support from post-secondary. The law was passed to facilitate planning for higher education and careers. It's established a task force. The task force is made up of a number of stakeholders, not just the agencies, but people appointed by the legislature, as well as community programs. We actually are going to have our first meeting in early August. It's not a governance organization. We already had governance through our grant programs. But this is really to provide advice and recommendations, how to sustain the program, look for long-term funding methods, since both our grants are winding down right now. Looking at other data resources, especially from other state agencies. And then our first report is due to the legislature on the beginning of November. So we've got some work ahead of us, but it's nice to see that support coming from our policymakers. And that's it for me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Bill. That was a really great presentation and fabulous overview of the real range of work that you have going on in Maine. I do have some questions for you before I open it up to our whole entire panel. First, you had many folks interested in having a little bit more detail about your NCES presentation that you mentioned. Is that something that's going to be open to the public, and do you know
yes.
what date and time you are scheduled for?
Yep, it's at the Marriott Boardman in Washington. I'll be presenting. I'm actually on the last session at 4:15 on Thursday, the 31st of July. There's no cost to go to the NCS Data Conference, and it's right on the Red Line, so you can get right out there. It's near the zoo. But yes, I'll be on from 4:15 to 5:15, and I presented there last year, and they seem to have pretty good internet connection, so I'm pretty confident I can do a live view of the whole system.
Well, fabulous, and definitely encourage folks that are local here to the DC area to try and attend. Another question. You listed the data sources that you draw from earlier in your presentation, and it's a real range. And folks noted that the National Student Clearinghouse was on there, which is you do have to have a contract. Are all the other data sources that you mentioned free, or is there a cost associated with some of the other data sources? And I'll pull that slide up as we're chatting.
Yeah, I mean, the systems are already in place. So maintaining those systems, I mean, we do have built in, one of the things we did for our sustainability plan on the grant was to make sure as we build systems that we build into the general fund ongoing maintenance support costs. And these systems feed other things. The state student data system is our statewide SIS. That's not going away. That's how we collect the data from all the schools. Same thing with the staff system. These are legislatively mandated reporting programs. Credentialing systems and adult systems, education system were funded through the grant, but we already have sustainability plans. They replace legacy systems, so sustainability is pretty easy there. Post-secondary systems, it's just using their data systems. They didn't build data warehouses. They're just giving stuff out of their administrative systems. The one that's a big challenge is the Wade Records Matching System, which came out of the WDQI grant with contribution from the SLDS grant. That's the one where the legislative task force that was created by the bill is really going to be focusing on how we're going to keep that going. The National Student Clearinghouse information, I mean, since so many people use it, that's in the budget. That's not going to go away at all. But the real challenge is how do we keep this website going? We expect there's going to be a lot of support and a lot of pressure on the legislature to make sure it's well funded.
And I think that's a great lead into my final question to you before we open it up is who do you anticipate making this information available to in the short term, and then what's the long-term goal in terms of who will have access to this information, and then will it be simply in aggregate form as you showed us here, or will researchers have the opportunity to have the de-identified individual records?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, one of the things that when the Department of Labor started to build the system, it was done on their Oracle internal system, and we talked about the fact there had to be a public interface. And what I showed here was Tableau They put that on top of the Oracle system. Yet the data is behind there, obviously with FERPA and other confidentiality. It is open to researchers, but we're very careful. We do have the governance systems in place. But what I showed is a public system. When we do the rollout, there's going to be a lot of publicity about it, certainly getting pressure from the workforce committee to make sure this gets out in the public. And I've already been starting to show it to some of the school systems. Had a chance to meet with over 125 of the school guidance counselors. They're already planning to use this in the fall to sit down with students who are looking at college. So very much a public orientation, but yes, researchers will have access to it based on all the rules around that.
Great, and I'm just going to quickly move the slides forward as I want to open it up to our entire panel right now, and we've had some really great questions that I think the group would like to respond to. And Rachel, I'd like to have you take this question first and then move to Josh and Bill. Folks are just amazed by the breadth and depth of resources that are available around using workforce data, and are wondering what's the best way to educate folks or even build the capacity around wanting to create more usable information from analyzing this data. So Rachel, could you take that question first?
Sure. So that's actually exactly why the Workforce Data Quality Campaign exists, because people who are in the know that this data, there's a lot of it out there, increasingly more each year, and that it can really do some powerful things for a lot of different stakeholders, as I mentioned, policymakers, educators, and businesses even. It can really help them look at how they're expanding and whether they're going to have the skilled workers they need. So our strategy has largely been to try to craft a message that's easily accessible to people and to use the kind of examples that Josh and Bill presented here today to show really concretely what this data can do and what it can mean for states and for programs.
Thanks. And Josh, can you respond to that question and maybe just talk a little bit about what was the impetus for Ohio to get started on connecting education and workforce data, and maybe talk a little bit about the first steps that were taken?
Well, the first steps that were taken are too long ago, but the most current iteration was brought on by the Workforce Data Quality Initiative grant that we received in 2010, I believe, and was renewed this past year. So, I would say the Department of Labor, as well as the SLDS people on the education side, have done a great service to the states in terms of kind of supporting this. I would say, yes, there is a lot of data out there. There's a lot of tradition in the labor market information systems world, which is typically a unit of the department in a state that deals with employment projections. So there's a lot of knowledge in each of your states of people who are listening in LMI shops that's been around, people who've done these matches probably for years on a cottage industry basis. I think the thing that is new is the fact that states as a whole are looking at setting strategic direction and understanding the effect of different policies and programs at a state level. And I think that is new.
Great. And Bill, do you want to also take a stab at this question and talk a little bit about, where Maine got started? I know you ended on sort of where you're looking to the future, but maybe you could reflect back for us.
It actually started around 2006 when we were starting to talk about applying for the 2007 grant, and I was working with the Governor's Workforce Cabinet, which was chaired by the Commissioner for Department of Labor. And John Doerr and I really started to look at what did we want to accomplish, what kind of research questions we wanted to answer, There also was a big push in coming from the legislators and the governor on how do we retain our college graduates and how do we encourage more of our students to go on to post-secondary education. And that was a concern. We have a very high high school graduation rate, but we don't have a high college matriculation rate. So this kind of data was going to help reinforce some of the things that we wanted to do to grow and expand the workforce, attract companies to Maine. We're competing with New Hampshire and Massachusetts. We really need to build out that workforce, and part of the system is going to help move us in that direction.
Thanks, and I have another question that I think everyone on the panel might want to tackle, and again, maybe we can just go down the line and start with Rachel, but I'm wondering, folks are curious about, on average, maybe you can talk about, Rachel, this from a national perspective, what percentage of education data has been able to be linked to workforce status on an sort of on average, and then Josh and Bill, if you could talk about that in your state-specific context.
Sure. So I don't have this in front of me. One of our partner organizations, the Data Quality Campaign minus the W, they have been, working on this issue for many years, and they do an annual survey of states. And I wish I had the number off the top of my head, but I believe it's, 19 states report that they link K-12 with employment data. And then I think there's about 26 states who report that they link post-secondary with employment data. And the employment data also sometimes includes data from one or several workforce programs. So it's roughly, I would say, about half the states at least report that they're doing that on a regular basis.
Thanks, and Josh, maybe you can talk more specifically in Ohio. What percentage of student records are you able to link?
Well, again, I think the same holes are there that Rachel and Bill were discussing. It's much more difficult to link K through 12 or CTE graduates because of legal concerns and practical concerns. I think all the higher education system and separate and distinct from what we might call the post-secondary system overall is linked completely if they're employed in Ohio. There are subsystems like apprenticeships that most of the states really don't have linked together, and I think that's a real shame. I think post-secondary vocational or career tech ed is another area that is sometimes linked but sometimes not, often because we don't have the identifiers in the system. The entry system, the registration system, so to speak, doesn't capture those IDs very well. So I think there's a lot of data. The scale of it is amazing. You have millions and millions of records of higher education or apprenticeship or workforce participants, and you can match 60–70% of them usually.
Thanks, and Bill, you want to talk about the experience in Maine?
Yeah, and I think part of what our success has been who we focused on. We knew we only had originally a 3-year grant program, so we looked at where we knew we could make some quick wins, and the post-secondary systems were the most receptive. We probably are able to get well over 90% of their graduates and be able to track them. We know we lose a certain percentage who move out of state, and some don't go directly into the workforce, but we have, as I said, when we did our initial pilot program, we had a 98% hit. We anticipate similar percentage with the adult ed because we have all the data and we have the IDs both from the K-12 and adult ed system. So, we're really focusing in those areas, but we hope to bring in some other stuff. But we really wanted to get away from the survey data. We just didn't feel that was going to be have the same level of accuracy. So what we've been able to do a very high percentage.
That's great. And I wanted to give everyone on the panel just the opportunity to talk a little bit about where they see these efforts going in the future. What's the next set of questions that you expect to tackle in your state, or what is the next hope in terms of data linkages, particularly with workforce data that you hope to build? And Bill, I'm going to let you take that question first, and we'll work our way back up this time.
All right. Well, I think I mentioned, our focus going down the road, and we're actually starting it already, although we're looking for more funding to help along it, just RISC-2 and FEDS, and looking at some of the data on occupational data. So those are three of our big areas. And I think it's also, as Rachel mentioned, other credentials other than post-secondary degrees. Be able to look at some of the professional certifications and pull that into the system. So those are really the focus areas down the road. Hopefully we'll be able to start working on those right after this rollout.
Great. Josh?
I think, just to make a slightly different point, that many states are not as concerned as they should be with employer data as well as with employment data. So in other words, the QCEW is a good example. We really, to make the data relevant, and that's the primary point, to users, whether they be economic development professionals or community college professionals or CTE professionals, you need data that connects to demand. And you cannot do that unless you have a good sense of the employers. And there is a reasonable amount of data that states collect on employers specifically, and making better connections to that is something we're trying very hard to do. The second thing I would say that's a priority for us is predictive modeling, using the data to enable, whether they be guidance counselors, as Bill was saying, or whether they be kind of commissioners, to make decisions, informed decisions based on the data that we're able to provide. And that's something we're working very hard on several tools.
And Rachel, do you have any thoughts from more of a national perspective?
Well, I think Ohio and Maine are really leading states on making this data useful, and I think that a lot of other states are kind of making this pivot from building and expanding their systems and building the capacity to developing tools to make it useful and relevant for different audiences. So I think we're going to see a lot more of those tools coming out, like the type that Bill and Josh have talked about today.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you all so much for your really excellent presentations and for helping us to really more deeply understand this issue, and of course sharing the experiences from our exemplar states of Maine and Ohio. I want to remind folks that there will be a short survey that we ask you to complete upon exiting the webinar, and of course your feedback is very important to us. And a second reminder is that you can also learn more and access a copy of the slides and the event recording at both our organization's websites at www.ccrscenter.org and www.aypf.org. Thank you again to our presenters, and a special thanks to all of those who stuck with us to the end. We really appreciate your time, and please stay tuned for our next upcoming webinar soon.